All right. Okay. Well, good evening. My name is Laura Brower Haygood. I am the Executive Director of the Historical Society of Washington, D.C., and we are honored to present this online conversation, The Most Important City, How the U.S. Government Segregated Its Workforce, with Eric Yellin and Samir Meghelli. So tonight, we all warmly welcome you to this virtual gathering space for an open conversation about institutional and systemic racism. This comes at an historic juncture, at a time when Washingtonians are protesting how white supremacy has impacted our city and often constrained the lives of those who have lived here. Like many of you, I'm sure, I hope that this is a tipping point, a moment of no return for our community and our nation. So a few weeks ago, and in response to the demonstrations filling our streets, the Historical Society launched an initiative we are calling Context for Today. Under this broad umbrella, we are providing carefully selected programs and resources that will help us better understand how Black Washingtonians have advocated for social change and justice. So tonight, we will explore how Black federal employees resisted the racist policies imposed by the Woodrow Wilson administration in the early 20th century. Our speakers will also consider what echoes we see in the current protests and efforts to organize. Their conversation will also look at how historians like Eric and Samir use journals, letters, and other personal writings in their research. Early in the pandemic, in April, the Historical Society issued a call to all of you, to area residents, to submit journals, stories, images, and artwork that respond to the coronavirus pandemic. We did this anticipating the interests of future generations. So, if you offer your COVID-19 diary to the Historical Society, perhaps a century from now, your words will also be included in a book like Eric's. To find out more about this initiative, check us out at our website at dchistory.org. I also really want to acknowledge our many members and the individuals who made donations when they registered for this program. Right now, the DC History Center's doors at the Carnegie Library in downtown DC are closed to the public. So these gifts, I'll be completely honest, to make a huge difference in our ability to fulfill our mission with programs such as these. So to each of you who could and did support us, I sincerely thank you. And if you have let your membership lapse, take a few minutes this evening to renew. So now I'd like to introduce our wonderful speakers, Eric Yellin and Samir Meghelli. Eric is the author of Racism in the Nation's Service, Government Workers and the Color Line in Woodrow Wilson's America. He is also Associate Professor of History and American Studies at the University of Richmond. And here in DC, he's the Senior Curatorial Consultant at the New Capitol Jewish Museum. Samir is the Senior Curator at the Smithsonian's Anacostia Community Museum. He has authored, co-authored, and co-edited several works. Most recently, he curated A Right to the City, an exhibition that explores the history and contemporary dynamics of neighborhood change and community activism in Washington, D.C. And you can now visit that exhibition online. So Eric and Samir, thank you so much for being with us tonight. The Zoom microphone is all yours. To our listeners, we're leaving a good amount of time for your questions at the end. So you can send those via the Q&A button on your Zoom screen. You should also keep a close eye on the chat, which we'll be using to communicate directly with you.
Great. Thanks so much, Laura, for that generous introduction, and to the Historical Society for hosting us this evening. I'm really glad to be in conversation with Eric and with all of you who've joined us this evening, and really looking forward to this conversation. So with that, I'd really love to just jump in and begin talking about what will be the center of this conversation, which is Eric's important book, Racism in the Nation's Service. With a question for you, Eric, around what was the inspiration behind this project, which began as a doctoral dissertation and then becomes this book? Why was it that this was an important topic for you to undertake a study of? What was missing in terms of what had been written about it and what remained to be said?
Yeah. If you want somebody to talk, ask them about their book. Great question. It starts in two ways. One is just the incredible training and teaching I had from professors like Eric Foner and Nell Painter and Dan Rogers and Barbara Fields, who challenged and have long challenged historians to think about how identity, right, how racial categories get made, right? Why is it that people can see race when biologists don't, right? What's social, where does that come from in our social lives? And so that was a question that I was trained to think about. And as I was thinking about dissertation topics and research topics, you read lots of things. And I've read one line in a textbook that said, Woodrow Wilson segregated the federal government in 1913. And I thought, well, what could that mean? Does that mean that it wasn't segregated in 1913? Which seemed pretty strange, because we know that segregation starts to cut across the United States at the end of the 19th century. By 1913, most of the United States, if it's going to be segregated, is already segregated. And so how could it be that something needed to be done in 1913? And then I started wondering, what does that mean for the state, the government, right, to impose this way of thinking that certain people cannot be near other people? What does it mean to justify that, right? And then how does that enable the process of making these lines, these differences, seem normal, right? How does federal policy and presidential leadership make what isn't normal, right, separating ordinary human beings, into something that can feel really normal and expected? And the fact that I was surprised that it wasn't segregated, and the fact that somebody had to do something to segregate it, sort of gave an opening there, right? We can sort of try to figure out what happened. And then I also knew that the federal government likes paper. And that means that there must have been a paper trail. There must have been something documented. And that's unusual. We know that communities had discrimination and racism and segregation brought in and tearing apart communities, really. But ordinary people's experiences of that have always been difficult to capture. And so here's a group of employees who left a record because they were federal employees. There's lots of paperwork for that. Could I find something about the experience of being made into a category, into a second-class citizen, a second-class member of a workplace? And so the federal government, as always, provided paper.
Yeah, and the story that you tell in the book, and the story of segregation in the federal workforce in the 19 teens and 20s, is also a powerful counter narrative to the really dominant narrative in many ways that American history is a story of just an incessant march towards more and more freedom over time, right? But that there's this really significant turning point, right, where there's this huge backlash and a transformation in the possibilities for greater justice and freedom. And so I guess I'm wondering how you began to think about that and this story as an important part of that, pushing back on that kind of notion of American history.
Yeah, I think there's two, or maybe three ways of thinking about that. One is that historians know that Reconstruction is a period of experiment in what would then be known as biracial democracy, right? A democracy in which Black men, not Black women, but Black men were given the chance to participate as citizens in the democracy, to vote. And then that made a huge difference in the lives of Americans everywhere, because we had something like a democratic system, even as exclusion still persisted. And that power in Black communities to vote meant that we had Black office holders, Black representation in policy, and Black representation in politics. And politics has always been big business in America. It's a way of organizing and resources and power. And Black men were enfranchised, were a part of that story into the 1870s. And then in the 1880s and 1890s, yanked out, right? Thrown out. In many cases, violently excluded and from the body politic, from American democracy, and that rise and fall was a story that historians have been trying to tell as a reminder that the American story and history in general is not always a story of things getting better. We also tend to exclude the federal government and national policy from that story. These become stories of Southerners, whatever that is supposed to mean. I'm always fascinated. My students often will see Southerners as white people. And when I say 40% of Southerners are African-American, they go, well, yeah, I guess they could be Southerners too, right? This segregation is supposed to be a Southern thing. It's not a national thing. And so the federal government gets sort of excused from that, right? And then the third way is that the story is supposed to be kind of clean and neat, right? We can, if we know something about the end of Reconstruction, it's really a story of the Klan and really racist white Southerners just putting an end to that democracy, maybe for reasons that don't even have to do with race. There are always stories about corruption in Black Reconstruction governments. So a story gets told that this is really neat and clean, that there's a kind of a redemption, right? That what happens at the end of Reconstruction is a reclaiming of good government. And that's supposed to end by the 1890s. And by the arrival of a sort of crisis of Jim Crow for African-American historians, right? This kind of nadir, this bottom in which African-Americans are really under threat physically and certainly politically. That's supposed to sort of be in place by the 20th century. And so what the DC story shows is that it wasn't so neat, that it was national, and that kind of up and down of human experience is ongoing and requires a kind of constant organizing, both for good or for bad. I mean, one of the other pieces of this is that for the federal government to segregate, something had to happen. It wasn't segregated. There wasn't segregation in the federal government. So somebody had to do something. It wasn't naturally occurring. And so there's not just a story of kind of rise and fall, but real active engagement in making change, and change that's not always for the better.
Yeah, and you mentioned DC, and I want to make sure we ground this in a local story. You know, everyone that's joined us, you know, likely is aware that DC is a self-proclaimed chocolate city for much of the past 40 plus years. And that DC became the first major US city to have a majority African-American population in the late 1950s, around 1957. But I think many people aren't necessarily aware that DC, long before the 1950s, was an important African-American city in many ways. And so I'm wondering if you can, both numerically, but also symbolically, and I'm wondering if you can say something about that longer history.
Yeah, it's a history that begins as African-Americans fight for and achieve freedom, as enslaved people in the South really win their freedom. They find DC a magnet, right? That's where Lincoln's government is. That's where the Union government is headquartered. And so thousands of essentially fugitives and refugees, African-American refugees, flee the South and into Washington, D.C. And so suddenly a significant number of African-Americans are in and around D.C. By the end of the 1860s. That process would continue over the course of the 19th century, at the end of the 19th century, so that by 1900, there are 86,000 African-Americans in a city that's roughly about 200,000 people in the whole area. But more importantly than the numbers, it's the proportion. They are not only more African-Americans living in Washington, D.C., and in 1900 than any other city in the United States, but there are a higher proportion of the population in Washington, D.C. than in any other city in the United States, right? So before the Harlem Renaissance, before that, the sort of New York or even Chicago being key sites of Black American experience, Washington really was the most important city for African Americans. And you can see that both in the numbers and in the people who lived here, Paul Laurence Dunbar and Langston Hughes and Anna Julia Cooper and Mary Church Terrell, and names that Americans and certainly African Americans across the country knew and read. But you can see it even in the coverage of DC. Black newspapers all across the country have these columns, Capitol doings, Capitol events, news from Washington. this community was on a stage, and what happened in DC really mattered to African Americans around the country.
Within that context, I'm wondering if you can talk about the evolution of Black federal employment. So why, as DC is becoming this important site for African American life locally and nationally, what was the role of federal employment in that? And I guess, can you talk about its evolution from that period of the 1860s where you begin to see a large influx of African Americans to DC, up to the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th?
Yeah, so there's really two things going on. One is that the federal government itself is expanding. The Civil War is a turning point for Washington, and it's a turning point for the federal government. Reconstruction, in many ways, represents a significant expansion of federal power and of simply federal offices. If you can imagine the Pension Bureau to manage all of the Civil War pensions, it's the #1 budget item in the federal budget is Civil War pensions into the 20th century. That's a huge building, a huge office. There's just simply more work to do after the 1860s. So as African Americans moved to the city for security and to be look for work out, beyond farm labor and enslavement, and the federal government is representing an opening as an employer. Federal employment at the time was political, right? And this, we talk about the spoil system, we talk about patronage, that federal offices were, certainly appointed offices, came through political parties. And that was true for everybody, whether you were white or black, north or south. The party affiliation was really, really important. African Americans are really connected to the Republican Party for obvious reasons. It's the party of Lincoln. During Reconstruction, most African Americans are Republicans, although not all. And so Republicans win national elections between 1860 and 1912 every time except two. The Republicans are absolutely dominant in the federal government. And so there's a kind of connection there between needing to find workers, right? People who can do the business of the national government, and party, so they really need to be Republicans. And the Republican Party, even at the end of the 19th century, as white Southerners really abandon the party entirely, the Republican Party wants to understand itself as a national party. It wants to employ people from all across the country. And in fact, federal employment law requires that each state be allotted a certain number or a certain portion of the federal employee register, a certain number of federal employment jobs. And so Republicans really need to employ Southerners. Southern Republicans are African American. And so there's a connection between party, region, and DC and the needs of the new national government that opens up all kinds of opportunities. In the 1880s, some of that patronage and political system will be torn away to be replaced by what became known as a meritocracy. It wasn't ever really a meritocracy. Connections in politics always mattered, but there were new rules about taking tests and about education and proving skills that by the 1880s and 1890s, African Americans are increasingly ready to do. The literacy rates of African Americans between the 1860s and the 1880s skyrocket, so that by the 1880s and 1890s, as the federal government is requiring these exams, African Americans who are moving into DC and have set up an education system are ready, and they are able to take advantage of those opportunities. And as Republicans, they're really important to the Republican Party. And so all of that sort of combines to make the federal government a really different employer than anywhere else in the country, right? No other sector in the United States was at all open to African Americans, and certainly not to white collar labor, sort of clerical work or skilled work. If you have a law degree from Howard University or a medical degree from Howard University, or even a BA from Fisk University or another college that will accept Black students, being able to use those skills and that knowledge anywhere else in the employment sector just doesn't exist. It's a racist employment system in the United States, except within the federal government, where you can get that law degree and become a lawyer for the government.
And can you say something about what that meant for African Americans in the district in terms of what federal employment did in terms of expanding the possibilities for mobility and life generally in the district.
Yeah. Again, there's a couple of things going on. One is you get some high profile appointments, and we're sort of used to seeing this. This has sort of been a pattern in American politics of naming a few people who can stand for minorities in government, and Republicans, were as guilty of tokenizing as any other, as at any other time in American history. And so there were a few really high profile appointments. Frederick Douglass is the recorder of deeds of the District of Columbia. Judson Lyons and Blanche K. Bruce, these are well-known, famous Black politicians, and they get these important positions. And they really are more than tokens, because at this point, at the turn of the 20th century, the Republican Party had not entirely abandoned its commitment to African Americans. And so these people become critical voices in the ears of major leaders and policymakers. So, and that can extend to trying desperately to get the federal government to do something about lynching, to getting the federal government to do something about voting. Those conversations were still ongoing at the end of the 19th century because there were these really high-profile positions, major leaders in positions. That's really only one level, right? And that's mostly symbolic. The next level is all of those people headed offices, and they had lots and lots of people working for them, and they had the opportunity to employ lower level white collar and blue collar employees, right? So by 1900, there are 3,000 African Americans working for the federal government. There are 400 white collar clerks. So those are people that a clerk is a really big category in public work. It could be anybody from a chemist to a lawyer to somebody typing, to somebody taking notes, and in some cases to somebody ferrying messages. But there are 400 of them, and they're all, because of this is a highly regulated employment system, they're all decently paid and stable. After 1897, the federal government has to give extreme cause for removing somebody. It's so that there's a kind of security, and that security that is protected by those upper level appointees in their own offices, and then down into this employment system that in some cases is merit-based, is about proving your efficiency and your ability to pass an exam. All of that creates a population of folks in DC who have work that they can count on, who have work that is uses skills that they've developed and is consistently paying. The clerkships paid between about $1,000 and $1,600 a year. Doesn't sound like much to us, but it was 2 times what most Americans, white or Black, made in the United States in 1900. So these are significant salaries, and they're salaries that enabled African Americans to invest in DC. Property ownership in DC goes up 500% between the 1870s and 1900 among African Americans. They are buying homes, they are buying stores, they're investing in one of the first Black banks. They are able to go to the theater. They are able to support Black-owned restaurants. This becomes a world in which one can legitimately do business in a Black community and expect that there's capital, that there's money to, so you get these incredible, what became known as Strivers Row, right? These incredible streets in Northwest DC with really beautiful, well cared for houses. And they're actually, many of them, ordinary government workers who can invest in them because they have these stable salaries.
Talk about what unfolds as Woodrow Wilson is elected and takes office, and as his administration settles in, kind of what unfolds in the realm of federal employment and the impact on African Americans, both locally, but also beyond.
Yeah. So when Woodrow Wilson runs for office in 1912, he pledges to be president of all the people. it's a largely what's sometimes considered a progressive election. All four candidates really identify as progressives, although Taft's claim on that is weaker than Eugene Debs, the socialist, or Theodore Roosevelt, the head of the Progressive Party, or Wilson, the Democrat. But all of them pledge in one way or another to be president of all Americans and to be progressive. And Wilson, in fact, in 1912 meets with a Black delegation, a group of Black politicians who are either independents, they're frustrated with the Republican Party because the Republican Party has allowed the disfranchisement of most African Americans. The Republican Party has allowed, over the course of the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century, hundreds of lynchings. It's not a secure and protective party, and African Americans have been saying that for a generation. And so there's already, there's a group of Black politicians who come to Wilson and say, you know, are you going to be a progressive? You're from New Jersey, you're an academic, maybe you have a shot with you. And he says, sure. And so W.E.B. Du Bois, the leading Black voice in the NAACP, endorses him. William Monroe Trotter, the activist, endorses Wilson. And so there's actually a fair amount of hope. And that hope is in part because things have already started to erode. It's this relationship that I've described between the Republican Party and federal employment is immensely fragile and requires constant maintenance. And African Americans know, and particularly Black politicians know, that Republican egalitarianism is fading. Taft, during his presidency, is not nearly as robust as, say, McKinley had been for supporting Black politicians in that world of Black work in DC. And then when Roosevelt moves into the Progressive Party, he really endorses a whites-only plank, and the Progressive Party tries to move into the South by embracing white supremacy. So there's a huge amount of doubt among Black politicians, and in particular this world of Black federal employees, about what's coming. And when Wilson says, sure, there's some hope, and there are Black federal employees who march in his inaugural parade in 1913 and seem reassured. They're wrong. What happens over in 1913 was significant and different than the kind of erosion of egalitarianism during the end of the Roosevelt and Taft administrations. What happens in 1913 is that Wilson loads his administration with white Southern Democrats who not only are racist, in some ways that's really ordinary to be racist for white Americans in 1912, but they are committed to white government. They are committed to a vision of progressive government that is for whites only. So Josephus Daniels is head of the Navy, and Albert Burleson, the head of his Postmaster General, and William McAdoo, the Treasury Secretary, now head agencies that had significant Black employment. And they, in some ways, didn't quite realize what Washington looked like. You see early cabinet meetings and letters where many of them are genuinely shocked. There's an assistant secretary of the Treasury, John Skelton Williams, who takes a tour of the Treasury and writes to Wilson and to other functionaries within the Treasury Department, did you know that there are Black and white workers working together? Did you know that there are white women working near Black men? There's a kind of shock that the system that these men had built in their home states, Albert Burleson in Texas, McAdoo, who's in New York before that, but he's from Tennessee, but also Josephus Daniels in North Carolina, the system that these guys had built to ensure white supremacy, to ensure that there weren't African Americans in supervisory positions in offices, there weren't African Americans with power. That system doesn't exist in DC, and they have to build it from scratch. And so what they start to do is first impose segregation. And that means that these assistant secretaries like Williams move through these offices and start just pointing people out and saying these have to be separated. But what is more significant and in many ways more just devastating to Black federal employees in DC is what happens to the careers of folks, right? So prior to 1913, if you look at a survey of African American federal employees, the vast majority had high ratings, high efficiency ratings, and were receiving regular promotions, were moving up in their careers, and were doing the same thing essentially as white employees, working, getting rated, and having their salaries, often, not always, raised. Demotions were based on whether you had done the job or not. Promotions were based on whether you had done the job or not. And that system of something like a meritocracy was persistent, and that's what really starts to disappear. And you can see it in federal records. Employees who had had a promotion every year or every other year for a decade, for 15 years, suddenly find themselves demoted. So you can go from being a $1,600 a year clerk to a $500 a year messenger. And one of the things that's sometimes confusing about this story is that the numbers of Black federal employees doesn't go down significantly under the Wilson administration. The number of clerks, of highly paid, socially mobile, career mobile folks, that goes down significantly. The number of promotions is essentially erased, right? And so certainly there is segregation. There's segregation in lunchrooms. There's segregation in bathrooms. There's segregation in offices. That's a part of the story. But the more significant part of the story for this community was these careers coming to an end, this ceiling being erected over how high one could go based on one's skills. And what's fascinating also, just really quickly, is that none of these buildings were built for this. And this was also a shock. None of these buildings were built to be segregated. And so it takes this enormous effort to reorganize bathrooms, to reorganize lunchrooms, to reorganize offices, because nobody had imagined that the federal government would be Jim Crowed, would have this system sort of imposed on it. So in particular, Black women report that they are forced to use bathrooms that were once men's rooms, and so they have these urinals in them. And also, in many of these offices, the number of bathrooms available to Black employees will go from 5 or 10 in these huge buildings to one, could be a mile away in some of these large buildings.
As we wind down the discussion portion of this, before we get to questions, I want to make sure that we also talk about the many different ways that African Americans responded to, resisted, and organized around these efforts. And there's a lot of really important, both well-known and not so well-known figures, from Mary Church Terrell, Ida B. Wells Barnett, William Monroe Trotter, Archibald Grimke, who play an important role in responding to what's unfolding under the Wilson administration. Can you talk about some of that and how that played out?
Yeah, so in some ways, as I said, in the political realm, the resistance is already underway. The resistance to Jim Crow in DC is already underway by 1912, 1913. And in many ways, the NAACP's, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored Peoples, founding in 1909 was a response to this crisis of Jim Crow, right? So the NAACP exists, but it's really exists essentially as a series of meetings in which people sort of argue over the right cause and the right approach. And federal segregation, the arrival of segregation in 1913 in federal offices, really gives the NAACP a real sense of purpose, that this is exactly what they had organized for, to block the erasure of Black rights from national politics and from national life. And so they very quickly establish a chapter in DC and start holding mass meetings and organizing giant petitions. There's a petition with 20,000 signatures presented to Wilson. There are mass meetings in Boston, in Chicago, and in DC, all organized by the NAACP or by sort of splinter civil rights groups like the National Equal Rights Group led by William Monroe Trotter. So there's a recognizable protest movement for sure. And that takes all the forms we would expect: marches and mass meetings, petitions and signs, and also investigations. One of the things that the NAACP begins to do is to try to figure out what's happening in these buildings, because it wasn't always easy to find out where segregation was sort of winding its way and whose careers were really being disrupted by racism. So there's that element of protest. Then there are the civil servants themselves who are shocked, right? In many ways, they had really thought of themselves as exceptions. And in important ways, they were exceptions, right? For most African Americans, the expectation of a promotion and decent pay was frustratingly out of reach. These guys really kind of expected. And so as soon as things start to change in 1913, in April 1913, a month after Wilson takes office. Remember, presidents took office in March, and at that time, by April, it's becoming clear what's happening. And they start writing letters to political appointees. They start writing letters directly to Wilson. William Monroe Trotter and Du Bois write letters to Wilson saying, whoa, we talked about this. What's happening? So there are these letter writing campaigns. And then there's within those offices also something recognizably that we would recognize as protest. So for example, in the Bureau of Engraving and Printing, the Treasury Secretary imposed segregation in the cafeterias. And three women, Maggie Keyes, Rosebud Murray, and Bertha Saunders, stood up and said, no, they're not going to move. They were literally asked to move to the black side of the cafeteria. And they said, we've been eating here for a decade. We're not doing that. And so they protested and they were all fired. And then there's a kind of quieter protest. African-Americans report that just simply won't go into these segregated cafeterias. And so you find African-Americans eating lunch in bathrooms, in behind buildings, people going without lunch because the humiliation in these segregated cafeterias was intense. And so that's a kind of protest too, a kind of resistance to just not honor it by escaping it. And then there's a real direct protest movement to Wilson himself. And as you mentioned, William Monroe Trotter and Ida B. Wells get in the room with Wilson twice and really get to put it to him directly and force him to get on the record, because he had been avoiding it, that he was in favor of segregation, that this was happening in the federal government. And then finally, just really quickly, there's all kinds of resistance we'll just really never know about. People who quit, people who passed, people who, there's one story of Bernard Quiller, who after 10 years of working in the federal government with no complaints is suddenly marked as difficult in his paperwork in 1916. That's a kind of resistance too, right? Just a refusal to accept that second-class citizenship and second-class working is acceptable.
As we near the Q&A, I do want to ask about, as you think about the legacies of how this segregation and discrimination reverberates out across time, what are the impacts that you see? You document the stories of folks like John A. Davis and others who, again, as you mentioned, this wasn't simply just a kind of segregation or separation in the workplace. This had just incredible and lasting impacts on the lives and communities of so many. And I'm wondering if you can offer some reflections on what that looked like.
Yeah, I mean, so you mentioned John A. Davis. John A. Davis was a skilled clerk who was put two sons into Williams and a daughter into Wellesley, and was living what we would sort of recognize as the American dream. And in order to continue that, essentially has to bankrupt himself. He's demoted from a clerk to a messenger in 1913, making about $500 a year, not enough to live in DC, let alone keep his kids in college. And so he sells, there was some family land. He absolutely bankrupts himself. And this story is repeated again and again of folks just watching their lives fall apart. And that is personal. It's intensely painful, and it's also community-wide, right? You can watch capital just drain out of this community, so that that African Americans in DC just have less to invest and less to live on, and that continues on in DC, because remember, it's not just separation; it is the refusal to empower and employ in decent ways. I think a second reverberation is the way in which it really reminds us about how policy and federal policy can matter and how it can justify and explain. So in this period, Wilson's endorsement of segregation is incredibly powerful for furthering and implanting segregation in American life. And in similar ways, federal support for punitive crime policy, right, in our own time, implants those notions and those assumptions into American life beyond DC. And so there's a way in which DC is often seen as a justice symbol, but it's a symbol that can really create change and really create, embed ways of thinking in American society. I think there's also, and this is a little complex, but there's also an element here of trying to convince progressives that what they're doing is leaving people out. Because one of the things that's confusing about this story sometimes is that Woodrow Wilson was a progressive in some important ways, right? A progressive in the sense that he believed that federal government could do things to make people's lives better, that there were ways to make people's lives better, that poverty and suffering were not inevitable, and that people could do things to make their lives better. That's how progressivism was defined at the time. And so how could this progressive, who really believed in making people's lives better, do this? How could he embed racism within that program? And so that's something for us to think about too, right? Is what programs that we sort of feel comfortable with because they must be for the good, right? What assumptions are buried in them that can have really devastating impacts, not just for ordinary people, but for our goals as to be inclusive and to be equitable. And one last thing is the powerful effort to delegitimize the protests in this case and in this story. What Wilson says and what Wilson's administration say is that these people are not suffering and nothing's happening. And they do everything they can to obfuscate what's happening. And so that those 20,000 signatures and those people who show up at mass meetings get delegitimized as just political complainers or people who are in one way or another corrupt and shouldn't be honored. And that delegitimization of protest and that claim that what they're saying can't be true because they're Black, that's something that gets deeply embedded in American life.
Thanks, Eric. I'm getting the signal that I'll be turning the mic back over to Laura for the Q&A. So, but yeah, thank you for this start of the conversation, Eric, and looking forward to fielding questions.
There, you're in the screen. All right. Hi, everyone. This has been a really heartbreaking discussion. And we actually have some really amazing questions. And so I'll just go ahead and launch right into them. First one at the top of my list from Craig. Were all federal agencies segregated under Wilson, or did some of the departments remain integrated, depending on the wishes of the department head? And I guess, Eric, that one's for you. Yeah,
it's a great question, and it's an important one because it's important in two ways. One is that no, not all of the departments were segregated to the same extent. Those departments that hired the most African Americans, that is the Postal Service and the Treasury Department, were segregated. And so most African American federal employees experienced this segregation. But there were departments, agriculture, that did not get as segregated. And that's in part because so much of what was going on in offices was based on what individual supervisors did, right? There was not a national policy, right, of segregation. In fact, because DC was governed by the federal government and the federal government did not pass a segregation policy, supervisors had a certain amount of freedom. And so there were absolutely supervisors who maintained some egalitarianism, but not in the places where African Americans had traditionally worked. And so it becomes part of the Black federal experience.
Okay. And so what formal steps did the Wilson administration take to segregate the workforce? For example, was there a presidential order? Did the civil service promulgate regulations formalizing segregation? That one's from Dave.
A really important question. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So a series of bills show up. They had been showing up for a number of years in the Congress, in a Republican Congress, that would just simply not review them to segregate the federal government. And then in 1910, Democrats take over the House. And then in 1912, it's really a sweep election for the Democrats, and they have power in Congress. And so a series of bills to segregate the federal government get put forth. And they're blocked by enough Republicans and a few Northern Democrats to not by law segregate the federal government. So there's no policy coming from Congress. Wilson does not issue an edict or a proclamation that federal offices will be segregated, which becomes really important when he wants to deny that anything's happening at all, until he finally will admit that offices are being segregated. And so there's no clear policy from the top. There are conversations in the cabinet. Albert Burleson, we think, is the first person to really mention it in a cabinet meeting, and he says, I'm going to segregate, and Daniels says the same thing, and Wilson gives his blessing. But no, there isn't a piece of paper, right? There isn't a clear policy that the NAACP could point to and say, this is the problem. And that makes the effort to fight the segregation that much harder. And in fact, what we know is that administrators within the Wilson administration really want this to go away, because it becomes quite loud, this protesting, and it becomes a part of DC life. And so they really want it to go away. And so what they do is they remove all of the segregation signs that had gone up in the Treasury Department or in post offices, and simply realize that all they have to do is assign workers to certain offices or demote employees. And so that it becomes a much more insidious system than, there's no whites only signs in federal offices. What there are no black people as supervisors, or everybody who's black in one corner.
All right. I have a question for Samir. In kind of this narrative that we've drawn, what is the role of Howard University in particular?
Yeah, I mean, there's actually a lot that can be said about the role of Howard, which was huge, not only in the city, but nationally. But given that Eric wrote so much about this period, I think it'd be great if Eric could share some of the stories of how Howard's connected to this particular period.
Yeah, Howard's a magnet, right, for people who, because it's this incredible education, and what the connection to this story and Howard, I think, is really interesting, is that folks come to DC out of the South, out of segregation and violence and real terror to the safety of DC, and into jobs that are, as I said, relatively decent, but often blue collar, right? Most African-American federal employees start as messengers, as custodians, as workers in factories like the Bureau of Engraving and Printing. And at night, they're going to Howard University. They're getting bachelor's degrees and law degrees. Laura Joyner, who's a woman who was a clerk for 30 years, went to medical school at Howard University, at night. So it becomes this place where you can take the security of that federal job, the education and promise of Howard University, and combine them and really make something of a career. Howard is also, of course, students, right? And so the student chapter of the NAACP gets activated by the federal segregation story. And so just like we're seeing today, and just like you saw in the 1960s, students become really critical to that movement. And so Howard being in DC and having a collective of activated students is really important for that movement. There's probably 1,000 different ways we could talk about Howard, but that's just a couple.
Absolutely. So you have, there are some familiar names here, I think, among the audience. Eric, there are some greetings here from the DC History and Justice Collective and #rename Wilson High School, and they want to thank you for your help. The question from Timothy is, how come we didn't really learn this about Wilson before? How come we haven't known this? It's a great one.
Yeah, it is a great one. Wow. So one part of the story, I think, is about how we talk about progressivism and progressives, right? What that word means. We tend to use it in ways that historians don't, which is we tend to assume it means the same thing at all times. And it didn't, right? Progressive, how I define progressive, the belief that one could make other people's lives better, things are not preordained, that didn't necessarily extend to questions of race. And Wilson was a progressive in terms of using the federal government to ensure that food was clean, that taxation was fair, that the currency was stable, but it didn't mean including African Americans as equal citizens. And so that progressive label creates a little bit of a cloud, an assumption that if if we all agree that untainted food and a stable currency is a good thing, then most of the things that that administration and that movement stood for must have been good things. And so some of that is about understanding some soul searching within progressivism, what it means to be progressive and what it means to be liberal, and where there can be failures, right, to really enact that vision. I also think that it's an easier narrative to imagine that Reconstruction was the end of Black politics, right? And that's just simply not true, right? So if we extend Black politics, then we have to figure out what to do with that. And the story in DC is really quite different. There's also a difficulty in dealing with government history. The federal government is a really interesting story, and it matters, right? There's a classic anti-statism in American life where we don't think of the government as having a story. And this story is really about, in many ways, about DC and the federal government. Good question, Tim.
All right, we've got another one here from Belle, who's the editor for Washington History Magazine. So shout out to Belle. She's got a good question too. What was the impact, if any, of Booker T. Washington's death and the waning of the Tuskegee machine on African-American federal employment prospects?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. So that Tuskegee machine she's talking about is Booker T. Washington's the principal of the Tuskegee Institute, which is the most prominent Black education center in the country. It's in Alabama, and Washington was a savvy player raising tons and tons of money for Tuskegee and for Black education, and also a savvy player of white sensibilities, right? Of how to try in some form or another to get protection from African Americans, right? He's in Alabama, he's seeing the lynchings, he's seeing the terror, and so he hopes that Tuskegee can fit African Americans to survive this. A lot of his ideas we would consider to be pretty conservative and pretty limited, but he really is in earnest. He also said that he wasn't interested in politics publicly, and that was a lie. He was really interested in politics because he understood that political power was important to saving Black lives and to ensuring Black citizenship. And so he was very involved with the Republican Party, and that Tuskegee machine that Belle's talking about was a constant stream of letters between national Republican officials and Washington's Tuskegee office to, in some cases, protect specific federal employees who have been targeted. In other cases, to try to protect Black voters. So the Alabama Republican Party tries to go whites only in 1906, and a stream of letters between Washington and Roosevelt put an end to it. The Alabama Republican Party maintains Black membership because Washington essentially called up Roosevelt and said, you've got to put a stop to this. So that was incredibly important for keeping these lines of communication and for keeping these lines of social and career mobility open. Washington really had a power to do that. By the time he dies in 1915, he really is a much less powerful figure. The NAACP has really made the point that his strategy isn't working, that African Americans are not finding equal citizenship and they're not finding equal employment, that you may get trained to lay brick at Tuskegee, but nobody's going to hire you to do that. And so his death is not a dramatic shift. He's also so associated with the Republicans that Wilson never really had anything to do with him.
Okay. Actually, this transitions well to the next question. So once the demotions and the lack of promotions started occurring, how did that translate economically throughout DC for Black families? What did that suddenly mean that families couldn't afford their homes, education? What was the ripple effect?
Yeah, so I'll try to make this really concrete. So what's remarkable when you look at the at sort of census records and of Black federal employees in the turn of the 20th century is they are very commonly in single family homes with families and their spouses, their wives, right? In most cases, most federal employees who were Black were men. That doesn't mean most federal employees were men. There's a rise of women in federal employment, but for the most part, and there are absolutely Black women who are clerks, but for the most part, they're men. And for the most part, they live in houses where their spouses do not list employment in which they own their own home or rent and live alone. And you can literally see that between the census of 1910 and the census of 1920 shift, where both parents have to find work, where boarders start showing up in census records, where people are no longer living in homes that they own. There's literally a dispossession, right? A giving up of property that comes from the loss of these decent incomes, right? These stable salaries that had allowed people to, they're never high. These people aren't getting rich, but because they're stable, one can, imagine that one will be able to pay off a loan, right? Or make rent. That really does disappear, so that by the 1930s, there is this fusing of class and race in Washington, D.C. that didn't exist in the 19-teens, right? There's always been class lines and racial lines in Washington, but those lines in 1910 were much more mixed up, right? Much more, if you could easily find a white-collar worker who was African-American, and by the 1930s, there are still thousands of Black people working for the federal government. It's still employing more than 25% of employees in DC, and most of the Black workers are in blue-collar custodial positions that don't pay nearly as well. And so literally, you can watch Black businesses disappear. That bank that I mentioned, National Bank, defaults, right? It is really a kind of disinvestment.
You touched on this a little bit, but I'd love for you to deepen this. What about the experiences of African-American women in particular? How was that different for them? And were there separate career tracks available to men and to women?
Yeah.
Clearly, yes.
Yeah, so there were, I mentioned Laura Joyner and Lucretia Mock-Kelly, who's an African-American woman who was a clerk for 30 years and has a really amazing story of coming to work because her veteran husband, who had fought for the Union during the Civil War, contracted malaria, and she has to find work, and she winds up moving up and getting promoted. So there were absolutely Black women who were clerks, but for the most part, there is a kind of novelty to the fact that Black men can do this work, this white collar work, high paying work, and so there is you find letters back and forth between men and women, Black men, federal employees, and women, sort of talking about how amazing it is that they can live the life that they wanted to, which in many ways would strike us as a very traditional Victorian separate spheres world, but it was one that many of them took a lot of pride in being able to live. And so you don't see nearly as many Black women in those upper level positions. The positions of custodian, and the term is charwoman, these jobs in which of domestic labor, that DC looks like the rest of the country, and in particular the South, that Black women work as in domestic labor. They work in domestic labor in DC in the homes of white employers, but also within the federal government. So that's certainly an employment line for Black women. In factory work, like Bureau of Engraving and Printing, there's lots of Black women working. They are not offered the same kind of mobility, right, from those positions. And so in many ways, DC is and the federal government is a world of women's work. But for Black women, it's not a world of promotion and that's kind of social mobility.
I love this one. Did any white employees or colleagues speak up in defense of their colleagues? Did white officials speak up and protest against what was happening?
Yeah, so at the time, the NAACP had white membership and white leadership, and there were mostly Republican appointees who spoke up and who testified that this was happening. But they're Republicans, and they're simply not empowered in the highly politicized world of DC, and so they don't have a lot of opportunity. There certainly is certainly a biracial movement. Oswald Garrison Villard, who was the secretary of the NAACP, is one of the major faces, and he's oppressive and had endorsed Wilson, and so he leads coalitions of other white liberals trying to stand up. Part of the problem here is that that layer of appointees that could be merely symbolic is now erased. And so for the first time, for example, there's a position called the Register of the Treasury, who really was the accountant for the Treasury and kind of keeping track of what was coming in and what was going out. That position had been held by an African-American for 15 years prior to Wilson's arrival. That for the first time is a white office holder. And that means that that political appointee, that person with a certain amount of certain bully pulpit or certain access, proximity to power is gone. And so there aren't enough people to really fight back.
Eric, you're just going through these questions like crazy. I love it. I do want to kind of interrupt the flow, and there's more. We'll come back to them. One of the kind of the starting points for this program and reaching out to you, Eric, is that we wanted to show examples of historians using collections of organizations like the Historical Society and similar repositories, and illustrate the use of letters and personal writings. And Samir, maybe this is something that you could speak to as well. How do you make use of this material? How is it meaningful for you? And were there any particular discoveries with this book that were just blew your socks off?
Do you want me to go, Samir? Or? Yeah. Okay. So part of this is a story of trying to write about people's lives who, we know the cliche, history written by the winners, right? History written by the powerful. Back to Tim's question about how come we don't know this, in part it's because telling the stories turned out to be difficult because the records I had hoped there would be all this paperwork, and indeed there was this paperwork. But prior to 1904, the federal government did not ask race on employment papers, right? So who were Black federal employees was like the first question I had to figure out when I knew, Wilson segregated what the federal government, who were these people who were segregated? There were no lists of Black federal employees kept by the federal government. And so that meant digging into records that we of marginalized communities, right? It turned out that there was a list of employment for African Americans in DC that the DC Historical Society had. It's called Sherman's and was printed in just 1 year, 1912, which was lucky for me. And it listed the job of every African American they could find in DC, including thousands of federal employees and hundreds of clerks. And so finding those names was the first step, right? And then because the personnel records of the federal government were not categorized by race, I had to ask for names. I had to have, I'm looking for this person. And so that's where archivists come in and people who collect. So Lisa Boykin, if you're listening, she was the archivist, the National Personnel Records Center, who answered 1,000 questions and hosted me for 3 weeks to go through her records. And then, stories exist in the archive. So Adrian Cannon knew that an archivist he had a family member who was a federal employee during this period. And that's how I got to Swan Kendrick, whose letters just happened to be at the Library of Congress. And so, stories that blow your socks off, I find myself reading the love letters between Swan Kendrick and the woman who would eventually become his wife, Ruby Moyes. She is in Mississippi, and he's writing to her about his life in DC and how he's going to marry her and bring her to DC, and they're going to have this really amazing life because DC is not Mississippi. He keeps saying that. She does eventually come to DC, and then racism overwhelms him. He's accosted in a bathroom by a white security guard who says, "What are you doing here?" And he says, "I work here." And so he finally has to quit in 1921. He has to leave her, and to find work, he moves to Pennsylvania. The family stays in DC, and he's trying to run a farm. He contracts a disease and dies. And I didn't see that coming. It happened in the letters. There's a letter from him. He's not feeling well. And then the next thing in the record is his death certificate. And I'm crying, and I'm a total mess in the Library of Congress reading room. That story of hope and loss exists because somebody kept those letters, somebody got them into an archive, like an incredible archive like the Library of Congress, and now we know not just the numbers, but the real personal suffering that this story entails. Oop, can't hear you. Sorry, I think you're muted.
Okay, yep. So I'll go back to, thanks for that, Eric. I really appreciate it. Go back to some of these these questions. So here we go. After the Pendleton Act established the federal civil service system in 1883, was segregation the rule or the exception in federal agencies?
Oh, Pendleton Act question. Now you're really getting, So
we're getting right in there.
Pendleton Act in 1883 is the first really civil service reform. It establishes the civil service, and it establishes the idea that there should be some kind of merit, right? That you take an exam and you show what you can do, and then you get put into a position within the federal government that matches your skill set. That's a reform in the 1880s to try to clean up some of the politics, some of this patronage machine that had really dominated American life. The Pendleton Act didn't cover most federal employees. In fact, most federal employees were not covered by the Civil Service Act until the 19-teens. And within the Pendleton Act, there was always the rule of three, the famous rule of three, which allowed supervisors to pick from among the top three top scorers on the exams. So there was always a certain amount of play for supervisors. The Pendleton Act and segregation are totally separate stories. The Pendleton Act imposes some order on employment. It doesn't dramatically change who gets employed. It does create an opening for African Americans to prove themselves, because you have to appoint at least the top, right? So a good score can vault you into a good position. And so it does create some opportunity for African Americans who can get around supervisor racism and just get to a real question of merit. The imposition of segregation is presented as a civil service reform by Wilsonian progressives. There's a man who was famous at the time in DC, Charles Cram, who nobody's ever heard of, was a supervisor, but he was also a management guru, a progressive management guru, and he brags to an undercover NAACP official that he's figured out how to segregate and call it efficiency. That there's a kind of, he can kind of overlap his management policies so that he's not only separating out white and black people and ensuring that black people are not equal, but that this can all be described as progressive management. And so those who push for segregation really do push for it as a progressive reform for good government, because good government is white government.
So back to Woodrow Wilson High School, can you say anything about the relationship between the decimation of the African American civil service and the end of Reno City, where Wilson High School is now located?
Yeah, so I wish Neil Flanagan was on the call. Neil Flanagan is a journalist and architect in DC who's done some really excellent work, kind of telling the story of the area was Reno City, or now where Fort Reno is, which was a Black community that was self-sustaining and really in some ways protected from the winds of racism around it near the end of the 19th century, that gets undercut by real estate developers, cleared out, and now that's where Tenleytown is, and up in Northwest DC. And the connection between that and federal employment is that loss of capital, right? That the fact that it's once you can't meet your obligations on loans, right, then it's easy for developers to come in and clear you out. And so the Strivers Row, the middle class community that's developing in what we today call Shaw, it wasn't called that then, all of that becomes much more fragile and much more prone to blockbusting and other real estate tactics to move, to ghettoize African Americans or to move them out.
Here are a couple interesting ones. Did Wilson ever express regret for endorsing the segregation of the federal workforce? Did he show any evolution or change over the course of his life?
No. I think that he really believed that this was the way things ought to be.
Yeah.
You know, and what's remarkable about the confrontation between William Monroe Trotter, Ida B. Wells, and Wilson is that they really make the case. What Trotter and Wells say to Wilson in 1914 is this segregation and this destruction of careers and lives runs counter to what you say you stand for. And they make that very clear. They really, it's not as if Wilson could operate not knowing what was happening and what it meant. They lay that out very clearly, and he gets furious. He doesn't like being called out as sort of having this failure within his vision. And he throws them out, and he never recants or moves against segregation. And in fact, when the United States goes to war, there's a well-known Black soldier named Charles Young, who's the most famous Black soldier, and African Americans clamor for him to have a position in World War I. Even if it's symbolic, he's symbolic of Black military sacrifice and prowess, and Wilson will not give it to him. He allows segregation to rule in the American military, and African Americans are not only given some of the worst positions within the military, but they're also denied opportunities to fight. They're denied opportunities to sort of prove their willingness, even though they sign up disproportionately. African Americans sign up to fight for the United States in World War I, disproportionate to their numbers. And Wilson and the Wilson administration will not allow them to prove themselves in the war. So there's really no recanting or going back on this position for Wilson.
Right, we only have time for one or two questions. And Samir, I want to give you also a chance to say a few closing words or observations. But here's one more. I understand that the second Mrs. Wilson accelerated the process to segregate the federal workforce. Is that true?
That's a story that really circulated in DC, that Ellen Wilson, who was a Virginian, was kind of an accelerator or a push for Wilson to segregate the federal government. The story was that she had toured a federal office and had seen Black and white. Did I say Ellen? I'm sorry, Edith. Edith is his second wife. That Edith Wilson had toured a facility and seen Black and white workers, and then went running to Wilson and said, "You've got to segregate the federal government." I never found any documentation of that. My understanding is that she supported segregation, but there's no connection between what Edith Wilson envisioned for the federal government and segregation. It was well underway before she's a part of Wilson's life. Ellen Wilson was also a Southerner, and his first wife, and may have had a similar position on segregation. But this is really coming not just from Wilson, but it's coming from the entire administration. It was well underway before any Wilson women were involved.
Samir, I wonder if you can just share with us a few words about your takeaways and why you think this subject matter is important, and why this resonates for us today, and in the work that you've done also at the Anacostia Community Museum.
Yeah, sure. Glad to do that. I mean, to some of the points that were made earlier, just in thinking about why it's so important to document history in the now, right? With an eye towards the future for future historians and community members who are interested in understanding this moment in history, right? That's so much a part of the work that we do at the Anacostia Community Museum. I think especially in this moment, this political moment we're in now, thinking about the ways that we can each participate in a kind of documentation of our lives and our work. And we've been involved in an effort with a number of other Smithsonian museums to actually document what's happening now, particularly with the protests in the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd. And, I think the study of this period, of the teens and 20s, where there's this moment of very explicit kind of racism taking expression and being manifested in federal employment, offers a window onto the ways that white supremacy ends up having just these incredible repercussions, not just in that moment, but actually across generations. And so, you know, even as there are pushes now to topple monuments, statues, and to rename buildings and institutions, you know, thinking about the ways that white supremacy and racism actually permeate these institutions as well. So moving beyond the symbolic, well, the symbolic is certainly important, but also moving beyond to think about the ways that we all can actually work to dismantle the ways that racism permeates in ways that are often not as explicit as they were in the time of Wilson. And so, you know, as we're doing this work now to document this moment, really trying to think about what that means for offering future generations a window onto this moment and the ways that not only racism and white supremacy are shaping this moment, but the ways that communities are responding to and trying to transform, you know, the realities of the world we're living in.
That's really beautifully said, Samir. Thank you for that. Eric, any closing words for you, or anything you weren't able to get to, or moments of reflection for us?
Yeah, I think that, you know, trying to think about I think symbols are important, monuments are important, names are important, but I think this story really is about structure and institutions and investment, and recognizing that it's going to take more than removing statues and names to make up for what was not an accident, right? Or what was not a blind spot, but an active attempt to keep Americans from taking a bite of the apple. And I think that recognition of not just something that was a mistake or in any way inevitable, but was really a part of that took effort and requires effort to respond to. Nope, I think you're muted.
Yes, thank you. A sustained, meaningful effort. Thank you both very much. We're now at the end of our time together. So I want to go ahead and queue up our next program. Next month, the Historical Society will present our next conversation. Is statehood possible? If so, how? So speaking to the history of the fight for voting rights. That will be with Derek Musgrove, who's the co-author of Chocolate City, and Bob Levy is a former Washington Post columnist. That will be on Thursday, July 16th at 7:30, and registration is now open. Or actually, let me take that back. It will be open very soon, and you'll get an email from us with that information. Either way, you should visit us at dchistory.org, or on social, you'll find us at DC History. If you're interested in buying Eric's book, we always like to plug the books of our authors, Racism in Our Nation's Service. You'll see a few links on the Eventbrite page connecting you with bookstores owned and operated by people of color. And I really want to thank you for joining us for this conversation. I'm really struck at how thoughtful and provocative all the questions were. We didn't get to all of them, but I thank you for submitting those and for your responses to what Eric has been sharing with us. We do want to know whether you liked the program, if you've forgiven me for little production challenges there, and then watch for your inbox for a link to our post-event survey. So last of all, just a huge thank you to Eric and Samir. You guys are amazing and are doing profound, important, and meaningful work in our community and in DC history. And then behind the scenes, I want to acknowledge a few wizards, Maggie Downing, Katrina Ingram, and Jane F. Levy, who developed and produced this program and did a fantastic job. So without further comment, thank you so much. Have a good night.